The night air felt colder as they left the restaurant, their footsteps echoing down the sidewalk. It was as though the world around them had shifted, casting a shadow over what was meant to be a joyful evening. But in that silence, something deeper stirred. The next morning, they would return not as disappointed patrons, but as owners of the very place that had turned them away. It's an unmistakable kind of excitement, isn't it? That buzz of anticipation when you're planning something special, something to break away from the monotony of everyday life. But for Alan and Denise, this wasn't just any night. This was supposed to be the night, a celebration of their 10 years together. They'd saved up, planned, and picked a place they were sure would deliver the perfect experience, a break from the usual. The venue? Claiborne's Bistro, an upscale restaurant in the heart of Santa Monica, known for its blend of fine dining and elegant ambience. But as they walked through the doors, the energy of the place didn't match the expectations they'd carried with them. Alan, a community organizer, and Denise, a teacher, weren't exactly what the restaurant's typical clientele looked like. Still, they weren't worried. Their outfits were simple, yet chosen with care. It wasn't about the clothes, it was about the night they had ahead. The host stand shone beneath the soft glow of chandelier lights, the scent of rosemary and freshly baked bread filled the air. It should have been a moment of pure enjoyment. But the second they stepped forward, something shifted. The host, tall with a rigid posture and a smile that felt more like a mask than a greeting, barely looked at them. He glanced at the reservation book, his fingers moving with deliberate slowness as though checking for something that shouldn't have been hard to find. "Do you have a reservation?" he asked, his voice flat. Denise's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, under Denise Foster," she replied, trying to sound confident despite the nagging sense that something wasn't right. The host skimmed through the pages, dragging out the process in a way that only deepened Denise's unease. Finally, he looked up. The tightness in his expression was unmistakable. "I'm sorry, but we're completely booked tonight," he said, his words hanging heavy in the air. Denise's eyes flicked toward the dining room. Empty tables. Several of them, untouched, their candlelight flickering like an unspoken insult. Her mind raced as she felt Alan's gaze on her, the unspoken question hanging between them, why? Why was this happening? Alan's eyes narrowed, the frustration building in him. But Denise, ever the calm one, gave his arm a gentle squeeze. A silent signal to let it go, for now. They stepped aside, the weight of the situation sinking in. The confusion, the hurt, the disbelief. How could this be happening on a night that was meant to be theirs? And yet, neither of them said a word. They walked out, side by side, the silence between them telling a story of its own. The cool night air did little to cool the frustration boiling inside Alan. His fists clenched, his jaw tight as he replayed the encounter over and over again. "Did you see those empty tables?" he finally muttered, his voice low and laced with disbelief. Denise nodded, her gaze still fixed on the pavement ahead. She hated confrontation, especially on a night like this. A night that was meant to be about joy, about celebrating them. "I saw," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking louder might break the fragile composure she was trying to maintain. They reached the car in silence. Alan's mind was running wild with anger, the sense of injustice cutting deep. For him, it wasn't the first time he'd felt this way, but it didn't make it any easier. Denise, on the other hand, felt a mixture of sadness and anger. She had dreamed of this night, of it being perfect. Instead, it was another painful reminder of the way the world sometimes treated people like them. Alan broke the silence again, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "We should have said something," he muttered, gripping the car door handle tightly. Denise turned to him, her expression calm but weary. "And what would that have done?" she replied, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. "It wouldn't have changed his mind." Alan exhaled sharply, leaning against the car, his gaze shifting back to the restaurant. The golden lights glowed warmly, a stark contrast to the coldness he had felt when the manager spoke to them. "It's not right," he said, almost to himself. Denise stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "I know it's not. But we don't have to let him ruin tonight. Let's just go somewhere else, okay?" Alan nodded, not wanting to upset her further, but deep down, the feeling that this was more than just one bad experience lingered. It wasn't about the food, or the fancy decor. It was about the way they'd been treated, like they didn't belong. Still, he didn't argue. They got in the car, leaving Claiborne's Bistro behind them. But what neither of them knew was that fate had already begun to set things in motion. This wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning. A story that would turn in ways they couldn't possibly predict. That night, as they sat in a quiet diner, sharing a slice of pecan pie, something began to shift. Alan couldn't stop thinking about the way the manager had dismissed them. The coldness in his tone, the look in his eyes that spoke volumes. Denise, too, was replaying the night, the excitement they'd felt walking in, only to be crushed by the sting of walking out. Suddenly, Denise stopped, her fork hovering mid-air. "What if we're wrong?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Alan raised an eyebrow, sensing the shift in her tone. "About what?" "About letting it go," she said. Her eyes locked with his, her expression thoughtful, yet determined. "What if we're supposed to do something about it?" Alan set his coffee cup down, intrigued by the intensity in her voice. "Go on," he urged, leaning in. Denise's eyes narrowed as the idea began to take shape in her mind. "You remember the papers we signed last week, right? The restaurant group's acquisition deal?" Alan nodded slowly, still processing the idea. The acquisition had felt like an afterthought at the time, a business transaction handled by lawyers and executives. But now, suddenly, it felt very personal. "What if we don't just own a piece of it?" Denise continued. "What if we own it? What if we show up tomorrow and remind them who really calls the shots?" Alan's lips curled into a slow smile, the fire in Denise's eyes catching him off guard. "You're serious," he said, more a statement than a question. "I am," she replied, her voice steady. "They treated us like we didn't belong. But the truth is, we belong there more than they know." The plan was set. By the time they left the diner, they knew what they would do. They wouldn't just return to Claiborne's bistro as guests. They would walk in as the rightful owners of the place that had turned them away. The late morning sun painted long shadows across the pavement as Alan and Denise drove into the parking lot of Claiborne's bistro. This time, their steps were deliberate, purposeful, as if the weight of the moment pressed them forward. The elegance they carried, a contrast to the dismissive air they'd felt the night before, now felt undeniable, anchored by quiet authority. Inside, the usual lunch rush buzzed around them, staff scurrying to set tables, arranging fresh floral centerpieces, but something had shifted. There was a tension in the air, even though no one could yet sense it. Behind the host stand, the same manager from last night, Elliot, stood with his usual rigid stance. As Alan and Denise entered, he barely lifted his eyes, assuming they were just another set of patrons to brush aside. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone clipped, bordering on dismissive. Denise smiled, an almost imperceptible smile that didn't quite meet her eyes. "Actually, we're here to meet with the team. Is the chef available?" Elliot's brow furrowed. "The team," he repeated, confusion lacing his voice. "I wasn't informed of any meeting." Alan stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying a quiet strength. "You wouldn't have been. But you'll want to gather everyone now. This concerns the future of the restaurant." Elliot hesitated, shifting his weight nervously, his eyes darting between them. Something in their tone, a firm, composed confidence, made him uneasy. Reluctantly, he motioned for a server nearby to fetch the chef. Within minutes, the restaurant staff, chefs, servers, kitchen workers, gathered near the dining area. Elliot stood off to the side, arms crossed, clearly irritated at the disruption. Alan cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "Good morning, everyone," he began. "My name is Alan Foster, and this is my wife, Denise. You may not know us yet, but we've been involved with this restaurant for a little while now. Yesterday, we decided it was time to pay a visit." Elliot's eyes narrowed as confusion slowly turned to realization. "Wait, what are you saying?" Denise stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. "We're the new owners of Claiborne's Bistro. As of last week, this restaurant became part of our portfolio, and as of today, we'll be taking a more hands-on role in its operations." A ripple of surprise spread through the room. Staff exchanged furtive glances while Elliot's face turned an ashen shade. "There must be some mistake," he stammered, his voice cracking. "No one told me." "There's no mistake," Alan interrupted, his voice sharper now. "We'll address that shortly. But for now, we want to assure everyone that our goal is to make this place the best it can be, both for the staff, the customers, and the community." Denise turned her gaze toward the gathered team, her words weighing heavily in the air. We've seen the reviews, the reputation this restaurant has built, and the hard work you all put in. But we've also seen areas that need change. One of those changes is how we treat people, our customers, and each other. Her words hovered in the room, thick with meaning. Elliot shifted uncomfortably but avoided meeting her gaze. The real reckoning, though, hadn't even begun. It would come when Elliot was called into the office to face the full consequences of his actions. Once the team dispersed, Alan and Denise asked Elliot to join them in the manager's office. The room, though neat and organized, suddenly felt stifling, heavy with the looming conversation. Alan took his seat behind the desk, while Denise stood beside him, her arms crossed, a composed yet commanding presence. Elliot walked in, his posture forced, trying to hold on to some semblance of composure, though his unease was palpable. He hesitated before sitting down, hands nervously fidgeting in his lap. "If this is about the meeting earlier, I wasn't informed," he began, but Denise cut him off, her tone sharp but controlled. "This isn't about communication errors, Elliot. This is about yesterday." Elliot froze, his eyes flickering with sudden awareness. "Yesterday?" Alan leaned in, his voice steady but carrying weight. "You remember us, don't you? The couple you turned away, claiming the restaurant was fully booked." Elliot's gaze dropped to the floor. A bead of sweat formed on his temple. I don't recall exactly. We had a busy evening," he muttered, his words lacking conviction. Denise's voice was firm as she interrupted. "Don't do that. Don't pretend you don't know what we're talking about. You looked us in the eye and dismissed us, as if we didn't matter. Like we didn't belong." Elliot opened his mouth, but no words came out. Alan's voice remained calm, but there was a steel edge beneath it. "We gave you the benefit of the doubt. We thought maybe it was a misunderstanding. But when we looked around and saw the empty tables, and the way you avoided meeting our gaze, we knew exactly what it was." Elliot's face turned beet red, his discomfort unmistakable. "I didn't mean any harm," he muttered. "It wasn't personal." Denise raised an eyebrow, the edge of her words cutting through the air. "Not personal? That's easy to say when you're the one handing out humiliation." The room went silent. The tension thickened, hanging between them. Alan leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Elliot. "Here's the thing, Elliot. You were wrong. On so many levels. And we're not here to humiliate you, or to make you grovel. But this restaurant can't succeed under leadership that treats people unfairly. Not the staff, not the customers." Denise's expression softened, but her tone remained resolute. "We believe in second chances, especially when someone shows they're willing to change. So the question is, are you willing to own up to what you did, and commit to being better?" Elliot sat there, visibly wrestling with his pride, the gravity of the moment pressing down on him. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded, slowly. "Yes. I understand. I'm sorry." Alan nodded in response, though his face remained stern. "Apologies are a start. But actions will show us whether you mean it. We'll be keeping a close eye on how things operate moving forward. If you can't rise to the occasion, we'll find someone who can." Elliot's voice was barely audible as he whispered, "Understood." The meeting ended, but the real work was just beginning. What Elliot did next would decide whether he had truly learned from this moment, or whether his time at the bistro was coming to a close.